White policeman traps black man. 10 minutes later, he was arrested by himself. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, but today it was nothing more than a stage for yet another rigged trial. Officer Thomas Grayson, a white cop with a perfect record of putting black men behind bars, smirked as he took the stand. He had done this before, planted evidence, twisted the truth, and walked away untouched. Jamal King, an innocent black man, was just another name on his list. The prosecutor was confident. The judge was indifferent. The jury was already convinced. But Malcolm Reed wasn't. As a defense attorney who had seen too many innocent men destroyed by corrupt officers, Malcolm had spent months preparing for this moment. He knew Grayson's secret, and he had the proof to expose it. All he needed was the right time to strike. Then, just as Grayson thought he had won, the courtroom doors swung open, and everything changed. The air inside Fulton County Courthouse in Atlanta, Georgia, was thick. Not just from the summer humidity, but from something far heavier. An unspoken tension clung to the walls, the kind of tension that came from decades of whispered conversations about how things really worked. It wasn't justice that dictated the outcomes here. It was power, manipulation, and the careful orchestration of a system designed to keep men like Jamal King locked away. Malcolm Reed had spent years fighting against that system. He knew every dirty trick in the book because once upon a time he had worked as a prosecutor. Back then, he had believed in the system, believed that justice was blind, believed that the law would protect the innocent, until he saw it fail, over and over again, until he realized that some people never got a fair shot, no matter how good their defense was. That was why he had switched sides, leaving behind his career as a state prosecutor to become a defense attorney, taking on cases that no one else wanted, cases that everyone assumed were already lost. And today, that case was Jamal King's. Jamal, a 28-year-old black man with no prior record, had been accused of drug trafficking. The prosecution had built their case around what seemed to be an airtight set of evidence: a kilo of uncut cocaine allegedly found in his trunk, grainy surveillance footage that appeared to show a drug deal, and, most damningly, the testimony of Officer Thomas Grayson, the arresting officer, a man whose name sent chills down the spine of every defense lawyer in the city. Grayson wasn't just another cop. He was the cop, the one who never lost a case, the one whose testimony was always enough to seal a conviction, the one whose name had surfaced in too many wrongful conviction appeals, but had somehow managed to walk away clean every single time. He had been on the force for 17 years, and in those 17 years, not a single one of his drug arrests had ever resulted in an acquittal. That kind of record wasn't luck, it was control. It was fear. It was a system that protected men like him. Malcolm sat at the defense table, his hands folded, his expression unreadable as he watched Grayson enter the courtroom. The officer walked in like he owned the place, adjusting his badge, smirking slightly as he took his seat. It was a performance, one Malcolm had seen before. Grayson exuded confidence, the kind that only came from knowing the judge and the prosecution were on his side. He didn't need to convince the jury. The game had already been rigged in his favor. Malcolm knew better than to react. He simply sat there, calm, steady, watching as Robert Calloway, the young ambitious prosecutor, stepped forward. Calloway was exactly the kind of lawyer Malcolm had once been: eager, self-assured, believing that his job was to win, not necessarily to seek the truth. "Officer Grayson," Calloway began, his voice carrying through the courtroom, "please describe the events of the night in question." Grayson leaned forward slightly, meeting the jury's eyes with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. "We had been monitoring a known drug trafficking area for several weeks," he said. "On the night of March 4th, I personally observed the suspect's vehicle parked outside a known distribution point. Based on prior intelligence, we had reason to believe he was involved in illicit activity. Upon approaching the vehicle, I asked the suspect to step out of the car and conducted a routine search. That's when I discovered a kilo of cocaine in the trunk. The words hung in the air. The jury didn't need to hear anything else. A black man. A bag of drugs. A white officer swearing he saw it firsthand. Malcolm could feel the shift. The silent way people in the room had already started deciding Jamal's fate. He waited. He didn't object. Not yet. Officer Grayson, Calloway continued, are you absolutely certain that the drugs belonged to the defendant? No doubt in my mind, Grayson said. And there it was. The lie, the unshakable certainty in his voice, the casual ease with which he framed an innocent man. Malcolm had seen it before. He had heard it before. But this time, he was ready. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket, his expression composed as he approached the witness stand. Officer Grayson, he said, you've been in law enforcement for 17 years, correct? 17 years. Grayson confirmed, nodding. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. And in those 17 years, how many drug-related arrests have you made? Hundreds. Grayson answered without hesitation. Hundreds, Malcolm echoed. And how many of those cases involved black defendants? The room tensed. Grayson's jaw clenched slightly. Calloway shot up from his chair. Objection. Irrelevant. Malcolm turned to the judge, a man whose history of siding with the prosecution was well documented. Your Honor, I'm establishing a pattern. The judge sighed but waved his hand. Proceed. Malcolm turned back to Grayson. You don't have the numbers, do you? Grayson exhaled through his nose. I arrest criminals. Race has nothing to do with it. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Really? He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick manila folder labeled Internal Affairs Report. Grayson stiffened. Malcolm let the folder rest in his hands for a moment, making sure the jury saw it before speaking again. This, he said, is an internal affairs report filed by an anonymous officer in your department. It details multiple allegations of evidence tampering linked to your cases. It specifically references a history of... That's a lie, Grayson interrupted, his voice slightly less confident than before. Malcolm took a step closer. A lie? Then tell me, Officer Grayson, why does your name appear in 5 different wrongful conviction appeals? Why have you never lost a case even when key evidence was missing? Why has every single case you've testified in resulted in a guilty verdict? Grayson glanced toward the judge, as if silently asking for help, but no one spoke. Malcolm could feel it, the shift in the room. The jury was paying attention now. The gallery, filled with reporters and spectators, leaned forward slightly. For the first time, Officer Grayson wasn't in control of the narrative. Malcolm turned slightly, his voice lowering just enough to pull everyone in. Let's talk about the night of Jamal King's arrest, he said. Where was your body camera footage? Grayson hesitated. It, malfunctioned, he said finally. Malcolm let the silence hang. Malfunctioned, he repeated. How convenient. Grayson's jaw tightened. Malcolm took a step back, pulling out a remote. Well, Officer Grayson, I have some footage that did not malfunction. He turned toward the TV monitor at the front of the courtroom, pressing a button. The screen flickered to life. The security footage from a gas station camera filled the screen. The video was grainy, but clear enough. It showed Jamal pumping gas. At the exact time Grayson claimed he was making a drug deal. A hush fell over the courtroom. For the first time in 17 years, Officer Grayson looked afraid. And Malcolm was just getting started. A heavy silence settled over the courtroom as the grainy security footage flickered on the screen, showing Jamal King pumping gas at a station miles away from the so-called drug deal at the exact time of his supposed arrest. The air, once thick with the prosecutor's confidence, now felt charged with something different. Uncertainty. The jury shifted in their seats. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward, and even Judge Walker, who'd been dismissive of Malcolm Reed's objections all morning, now seemed uneasy. Malcolm let the silence linger, watching Officer Thomas Grayson's expression shift. The once smug confidence drained from his face, replaced with a flicker of something unfamiliar. Was it panic? No, not yet. Not quite. Grayson wasn't the type to break so easily. He had been in this position before and had always walked away unscathed. But today, Malcolm wasn't here to let him walk away. Malcolm turned off the screen and slowly faced Grayson. "Officer," he said, his voice calm, calculated. "You testified under oath that you personally witnessed my client engaging in a drug transaction at the corner of McPherson and Pine at exactly 9:45 p.m. on the night of March 4th, correct?" Grayson crossed his arms, his mouth pressing into a tight line. "That's right." Malcolm raised his eyebrows, motioning to the now dark screen. "Yet, as you can see from the footage, at that exact time, my client was nowhere near McPherson and Pine. He was at a gas station more than 5 miles away." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "So, Officer Grayson, how exactly did you see him making a drug deal from 5 miles away?" The room tensed. The jury was listening now, their earlier assumptions now clouded with doubt. Grayson didn't flinch. "Maybe the timestamp on the video is wrong," he said smoothly. "Or maybe your client drove there after he made the deal. Either way, that doesn't change the fact that we found a kilo of cocaine in his trunk." Malcolm nodded, as if considering it. He glanced over at Jamal, who sat stiffly, his hands clenched together on the table, knuckles white. He had been in this position before, falsely accused, forced to watch the system try to crush him, told that his word meant nothing against a white cop's testimony. Not today. Malcolm turned back to Grayson. "I'm glad you brought that up," he said, "because I have a question about that so-called discovery." He pulled out another document from his briefcase and held it up. "According to the official search report, you stated that you found the drugs in the trunk of Jamal King's car after a lawful search." "That's correct." Malcolm flipped to another page. "And the inventory log, which you personally signed, states that the bag of cocaine was sealed and tagged at precisely 10:15 p.m. that night." Grayson nodded once, but Malcolm caught the way his fingers tapped against his leg. An unconscious tick. He was nervous. Malcolm allowed a small smile. "That's interesting," he said, "because according to Officer Derek Williams' testimony, your own partner that night, the search didn't happen until 10:40 p.m. So tell me, Officer Grayson, how exactly did you document evidence 25 minutes before you even found it?" The jury stiffened. The judge leaned forward slightly. Even the young prosecutor, Robert Calloway, looked shaken. Grayson's face darkened. "I don't know what you're trying to pull here, Reed, but I'm trying to pull the truth, officer." Malcolm interrupted, his voice sharper now. "Because the only explanation for this discrepancy is fabrication. You filed a report before you even found the evidence because the evidence didn't exist until you put it there." "Objection!" Calloway shot up from his chair, his voice cracking slightly. "The defense is making baseless accusations." Malcolm turned toward him. "Baseless? Your Honor, I just presented a clear timeline that contradicts the officer's sworn statement. If the prosecution would like to explain how evidence can be logged before it's even discovered, I'm more than happy to listen." The judge hesitated. Calloway's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Malcolm turned back to Grayson. "Tell me something, officer," he continued. "In your 17 years of making drug arrests, how many times have you discovered evidence before actually searching for it?" Grayson was silent. Malcolm took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that the courtroom had to strain to hear. "And how many times have you gotten away with it?" A ripple of whispers spread through the room. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore, this was bigger. The gallery was filled with people who had seen too many men like Jamal go to prison on shaky evidence and questionable testimony. They had heard stories of Grayson before, whispered between lawyers, discussed quietly in families who had lost loved ones to the prison system. But today, those whispers were being said out loud. Malcolm could see it in the jury's eyes, the realization that they might be complicit if they let this slide. Grayson shifted in his seat, His smug confidence was cracking now, but Malcolm wasn't done. "One last question," Malcolm said. "When you pulled my client over, you claimed his car had a broken taillight, which gave you probable cause to conduct a search. Correct?" "That's right." Malcolm pulled out one last piece of evidence. He handed it to the bailiff, who walked it over to the judge before displaying it on the screen for the jury. It was a traffic camera photo, time-stamped just minutes before Jamal's arrest. His taillights were perfectly intact. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Malcolm stepped back. "No further questions, Your Honor." The silence that followed wasn't just heavy. It was explosive. The jury was no longer uncertain. They were angry. The gallery erupted into murmurs, people whispering to one another, reporters scribbling frantically in their notepads. Even Judge Walker, who had seemed dismissive of Malcolm earlier, now looked uneasy. The damage was done. Officer Thomas Grayson had just been exposed, and Malcolm wasn't the only one who knew it. At that moment, the courtroom doors burst open. Two men in dark suits strode in, their movements crisp, authoritative. The emblem on their badges caught the light, making it clear who they were before they even spoke. FBI. The taller of the two agents stepped forward, his voice cool and unwavering. "Officer Thomas Grayson," he said, holding up a folded document. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The room froze. Grayson blinked, his mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The lead agent stepped closer, pulling out a second document. "You are being charged with evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, perjury, and multiple violations of civil rights under federal law." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge paled. Calloway's face drained of color. For the first time since he had stepped onto the witness stand, Grayson looked afraid. And Malcolm? Malcolm just smoothed his tie and folded his arms, watching as the scales of justice finally began to tip. Grayson turned toward him, his voice barely a whisper. "You set me up." Malcolm tilted his head. "No, officer," he said. "You set yourself up. I just made sure the truth finally caught up with you." As the FBI agents moved to cuff Grayson right there in the courtroom, Malcolm glanced at his client. Jamal's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from relief. Because for the first time in his life, the system had worked in his favor. But Malcolm knew better than to celebrate too soon. Because this fight wasn't over yet. The click of the handcuffs locking around Officer Thomas Grayson's wrists echoed through the courtroom, sharper and louder than any gavel strike. For 17 years he had ruled these halls with unchecked power, manipulating evidence, silencing voices, and ensuring that men like Jamal King never stood a chance. But today, the walls were closing in, and the system that had protected him for so long was finally turning against him. The two FBI agents flanked him on either side, their grips firm as they secured his arms. But it was the weight of his own arrogance that truly pinned him down. He didn't struggle. He was too stunned for that. But his eyes darted across the room, searching for someone, anyone, to step in and save him. But there was no one, not the judge, who sat frozen on his bench, not the prosecutor, Calloway, who was still gripping the edge of his desk like a drowning man clinging to a life raft, not his fellow officers who had once applauded his arrests and backed his testimony without question, because now they all knew. Malcolm Reed exhaled slowly, watching the scene unfold, letting the weight of the moment settle. He had been in countless trials, had fought battles inside and outside these courtrooms, had seen corruption win more times than he cared to count. But today, justice had finally fought back. He turned to Jamal King, who sat rigid beside him, his hands still clenched into fists on the defense table. Jamal had spent months preparing himself for the worst, for the inevitable guilty verdict that so many before him had faced. And now, with the very officer who framed him being led away in cuffs, he didn't seem to know how to process it. Malcolm leaned slightly toward him, voice low but steady. "It's over," he said. "They can't touch you now." Jamal let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like years. His shoulders relaxed, but only slightly, as if his body still wasn't convinced that freedom was real. The courtroom, still thick with stunned silence, felt like a pressure cooker about to burst. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, their faces alight with the thrill of a scandal unfolding in real time. Spectators whispered in hushed, disbelieving voices. Even the jury, who had been so sure of their decision just minutes ago, now sat stiff, their eyes flickering between Malcolm and the empty space where Grayson had just stood, as if recalibrating everything they thought they knew about this case. The lead FBI agent, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, turned toward Judge Walker, who was still gripping his gavel, though he had yet to use it. "Your Honor," the agent said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Given these new developments, we will be launching a full investigation into previous convictions linked to Officer Grayson. We request that this trial be immediately reviewed in light of the overwhelming evidence of misconduct." Malcolm didn't wait for the judge to respond. He pushed back his chair, standing tall as he turned to face the bench. "Your Honor, the prosecution's entire case was built on the testimony of a corrupt officer. The evidence was fabricated. The charges against my client were false from the start. I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges." His voice was steady, but inside, his pulse was thrumming. He had spent his entire career watching men like Jamal lose, watching corrupt officers walk free, watching the system fail the people it was supposed to protect. This moment mattered. Judge Walker shifted in his seat, clearly uneasy. He had never been a man who liked surprises, and this one had just shaken his entire courtroom to its core. He cleared his throat, glancing toward Calloway, the young prosecutor who now looked like he wished he were anywhere but here. "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, his voice thick, "does the prosecution have any objections to the defense's motion?" Calloway opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? That the case was still solid? That Jamal should still be convicted? His entire argument had just collapsed in front of him, and everyone in the room knew it. Finally, after a long, tense pause, he shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." Malcolm felt a rush of relief, but he didn't let it show. He simply nodded, as if this was the only possible outcome. Judge Walker took a long breath before turning to the jury, his voice gruff but steady. "In light of this new information, the court finds the charges against Jamal King to be unfounded and unjust. The case is dismissed." The room erupted. A cheer broke out from the gallery, hushed at first, like people were afraid this might all be some cruel joke, but then louder, swelling into something real, something undeniable. Malcolm turned to Jamal as the bailiff moved to unlock the handcuffs from his wrists. The metal fell away with a quiet click, but the sound might as well have been a thunderclap. Jamal's hands were his own again. For a moment, he just stared down at them, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Then, slowly, he flexed his fingers, feeling the freedom that had almost been stolen from him. He looked up at Malcolm, his expression a mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and something else. Something heavier. "I don't even know what to say," he murmured. Malcolm placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, "because today the system actually worked. Not because it was designed to, but because we forced it to." Jamal swallowed hard, nodding. He turned to the gallery where his family was waiting. His mother, tears streaming down her face. His younger brother clapping a hand over his mouth in shock. He took a step toward them, then another. Then suddenly, he was running, arms outstretched, as his mother pulled him into a crushing embrace. Malcolm let out a slow breath, watching as the moment unfolded. But he wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because while this battle was over, the war was far from won. Grayson might have been caught, but how many more officers just like him were still out there? How many more Jamal Kings were sitting in jail cells right now, their voices unheard, their cases built on lies? One victory didn't change the system. It only proved that change was possible. He turned to leave, grabbing his briefcase as he strode toward the exit. But just as he reached the doors, a voice called out behind him, "Mr. Reed." He turned. It was Calloway. The young prosecutor looked exhausted, shaken, like a man who had just realized he had been playing for the wrong team. He started, then hesitated. I didn't know. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded. Now you do, he said. What are you going to do about it? Calloway had no answer. Malcolm didn't wait for one. He stepped out into the warm Atlanta air, rolling his shoulders as the weight of the courtroom finally lifted off of him. But he wasn't relieved. If anything, he was more determined than ever. Today had been a victory, yes, but it had taken months of work, countless hours, and undeniable evidence to bring just one corrupt cop to justice. How many more were still walking free? Malcolm tightened his grip on his briefcase. One down, but there was still work to do, and tomorrow he would be ready. Vin Diesel, disguised as a homeless man, exposes shocking police bias in Golden Park. This jaw-dropping encounter has not only sparked public outrage, but also raised serious questions about fairness in society. Stay tuned to see the details of this bold experiment, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every perspective helps drive change. It was a cool October afternoon in San Francisco, and Golden Park, the city's vibrant heart, bustled with life. Joggers followed their familiar routes, parents pushed strollers along winding paths, and dogs bounded across lush green lawns, chasing frisbees with unrestrained joy. Near the park's iconic gold fountain, a solitary figure sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, his face partially obscured by the hood of a gray sweatshirt. That figure was none other than Vin Diesel. Gone was the polished aura of a Hollywood star. In its place was an air of quiet anonymity. Dressed in faded jeans, scuffed boots, and an oversized coat, Vin blended seamlessly into the park's scenery. Beside him rested a crumpled brown paper bag, further solidifying the illusion of someone down on his luck. As he adjusted his hood and leaned back on the bench, Vin observed the comings and goings of the park with sharp, watchful eyes. This wasn't just an idle afternoon for him. It was a mission. Vin had undertaken this bold experiment to shine a light on social biases, especially those faced by individuals who society often overlooks. Today, he wasn't a global celebrity, but a man testing the boundaries of empathy and fairness. The peaceful scene didn't last long. A police cruiser rolled slowly into the gravel parking lot nearby, its engine humming softly before coming to a stop. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching against the gravel as they surveyed the area. Officer Daniels, a young cop with a buzz cut, scanned the park with an intense gaze, his expression stern. Beside him, Sergeant Hayes, an older, weary-looking officer, sipped from a coffee cup, the edges of his uniform frayed from years on the force. Daniels nodded toward Vin, a flicker of disdain in his eyes. Another vagrant, he muttered to Hayes. This park's starting to look like a homeless shelter. Hayes sighed deeply, adjusting his belt with a tired motion. Let's see what he's up to, he replied, though his tone carried no urgency. The two officers began walking toward the bench, their steps slow and deliberate. Vin didn't flinch, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground as though he hadn't noticed their approach. His hands rested loosely on his lap, his posture calm. But inside, every nerve was attuned to their presence. You can't sit here all day, Daniel said, his sharp voice cutting through the park's ambient hum. This isn't your living room. Vin slowly raised his head, his hood casting a shadow over his dark eyes. His expression was neutral, unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, instead reaching into the paper bag beside him. The motion caused Daniels to stiffen, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton on his belt. Easy, Hayes murmured, glancing at his partner with a note of caution. Let's not jump to conclusions. Vin pulled out a sandwich, wrapped in wax paper, and began unwrapping it with methodical precision. He took a deliberate bite, chewing slowly, as though the officers weren't even there. His quiet defiance seemed to irritate Daniels further. Hey, I'm talking to you, Daniels snapped, stepping closer. You got somewhere to go? Or are you planning to camp out here all day? Vin swallowed the bite and finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not bothering anyone, just eating my lunch." Daniels scoffed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not the point," he retorted. "People like you make this place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." "Daniels?" Hayes interjected, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. "Dial it back." But Daniels pressed on. "Let me see some ID," he demanded, holding out his hand. Vin set his sandwich carefully on the bench and reached into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to Daniels without protest. The younger officer flipped it open, squinting at the ID with a skeptical expression. "Vincent Sinclair," Daniels read aloud, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What are you, some kind of out-of-work musician?" Vin's face remained neutral as Daniels returned the wallet. Hayes, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "He's not doing anything illegal," he said, crossing his arms. "We don't have a reason to make him leave." "No," Daniels shot back, his voice lowering. "But we can make it uncomfortable for him." Vin's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. He picked up the sandwich again and took another bite, ignoring the simmering tension radiating from Daniels. Across the park, a woman walking her golden retriever had stopped to watch the interaction. Her name was Margaret Bennett, a retired school teacher with a strong sense of justice. She frowned at the scene unfolding before her and hesitated before calling out, "Hey, he's not doing anything wrong. Why are you harassing him?" Daniels turned to her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said curtly. Margaret, undeterred, replied, "It does concern me. This is a public park, and he has every right to sit there." Hayes raised a hand in an attempt to de-escalate. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Please, move along." Margaret muttered something under her breath, but eventually turned and walked away, shaking her head. Vin watched her leave, a flicker of gratitude flashing briefly across his face. "Am I free to go?" Vin asked, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge. "You're not under arrest," Hayes replied, throwing a warning glance at Daniels. "But maybe it's best if you find another spot." Vin stood slowly, his movements deliberate. His broad shoulders and tall frame seemed to make the space around him shrink. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice steady and deliberate. As Vin walked away, Daniels muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. "Did you see the way he looked at me? Guy thinks he's better than us." "Let it go," Hayes replied wearily. "He's not worth the trouble." But Daniels wasn't ready to let it go. As he climbed back into the cruiser, his mind raced with suspicions. Something about the man's calm composure unsettled him. "I don't trust him," he said finally. "There's something off about him." Hayes sighed, already turning his attention back to his coffee. "You don't have to trust him," he replied. "You just have to leave him alone." But Daniels couldn't let it go. As the cruiser's engine hummed back to life, he kept his eyes on Vin's retreating figure, his mind turning over every detail. Whatever it was about that man, Daniels was determined to find out. Vin Diesel walked away from the bench, his broad frame moving with quiet confidence as he disappeared into the twisting paths of Golden Park. The cool October air brushed against his face, but his mind was laser-focused. Every step of this experiment was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. The subtle shift in Officer Daniels's tone, the unease in Sergeant Hayes's voice, and the brief intervention from Margaret Bennett. All of it painted a clear picture of how authority responded to perceived vulnerability. But Vin knew this was just the beginning. Behind him, the police cruiser sat idling, its engine humming softly. Inside, Daniels was far from calm. His jaw tightened as he stared out the windshield, watching the direction Vin had gone. "There's something wrong with that guy," Daniels muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Hayes sipped his coffee, letting out a weary sigh. Daniels, it's over. Let it go. No, it's not, Daniels shot back, turning to his partner with a scowl. You saw how he acted. Too calm, too smug. He's hiding something. He's eating a sandwich in a public park, Hayes replied flatly. That's not a crime. Daniels ignored him, his mind racing. Something about the man unsettled him. It wasn't just the way he had brushed off their authority. It was the way he had done it with such ease, as though he wasn't the least bit afraid. Daniels hated that feeling, the sense that he wasn't in control. He slammed the cruiser into gear, turning it down the path where Vin had walked. Where are you going? Hayes asked, his voice rising slightly. Just making sure he's not up to something, Daniels replied, his tone clipped. Hayes groaned but didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that when Daniels got like this, there was no point in reasoning with him. Still, as they drove slowly through the park, Hayes couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that this was going to spiral into something far bigger than it needed to be. Meanwhile, Vin had settled on another bench further into the park, this one tucked beneath a canopy of golden-leafed oak trees. The area was quieter here, with fewer joggers and strollers passing by. He placed the crumpled brown bag beside him once again, leaning back and allowing himself to take in the scene. His mind, however, was working overtime. This wasn't the first time Vin had conducted an experiment like this. Over the years, he had become increasingly aware of how society treated people based on appearances. The idea for today's test had been sparked by countless stories he'd heard from friends and fans. Stories of mistreatment, profiling, and outright bias. As someone with influence, Vin felt a responsibility to shed light on these issues. But he also knew that real change required more than just talking. It required action. As he sat there, his sharp eyes caught sight of the police cruiser approaching in the distance. A faint smile played on his lips. He had expected them to come back. The tension he had seen in Daniel's face was a clear indicator that the young officer wouldn't let this go so easily. Vin adjusted his hood slightly, leaning forward as though lost in thought. The cruiser came to a halt nearby, and Daniel stepped out first, his boots crunching on the gravel path. Hayes followed reluctantly, his expression one of resigned frustration. You again, Daniels called out as he approached the bench. His tone was sharper now, more aggressive. Couldn't find another park to loiter in? Vin didn't move immediately, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before finally looking up. His expression was calm, almost bored. Is sitting on a bench illegal now? He asked, his voice steady. Daniel's jaw tightened. Don't get smart with me, he snapped, stopping a few feet from the bench. You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out. Hayes stepped in, raising a hand to his partner. Daniels, what are you doing? We already cleared him. He's up to something, Daniels insisted, his eyes never leaving Vin. I can feel it. That's not how the law works, Hayes replied, his tone tinged with exasperation. You can't just hassle someone because you feel like it. Vin leaned back slightly, his posture still relaxed. I think your partner's right, he said, his voice even. If I'm not breaking the law, then maybe you should move on. Daniels bristled at the comment, taking another step closer. His hand rested on the baton at his hip, a subtle but unmistakable gesture. What's in the bag? He demanded. Vin tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. Lunch, he replied. Prove it. A flicker of amusement crossed Vin's face, but he didn't argue. He picked up the bag and held it out, allowing Daniels to peer inside. The younger officer frowned as he saw the contents, an apple, a sandwich, and a bottle of water. You got anything else on you? Daniels pressed. Something you don't want us to find? Vin set the bag down carefully, his movements deliberate. I've got nothing to hide, he said. But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one you'll find it with. Hayes sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Let it go, Daniels, he said, his voice firm. We've got better things to do. But Daniels wasn't ready to back down. His suspicion had turned into something far more personal now. He couldn't stand the calm defiance in Vin's demeanor, the way he refused to show fear or submission. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," Daniels said, his tone low and sharp. "Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous." Vin didn't flinch. "Most people aren't breaking any laws," he replied simply. "Are you saying I should be nervous?" The question seemed to catch Daniels off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose," he said, his voice hardening. "And that makes me wonder what you're hiding." Vin leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Daniels. "You've searched me. You've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you." The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps, curiosity evident on their faces. Hayes stepped in once more, placing a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. "That's enough," he said, his tone sharp. "We're done here." For a moment, it looked like Daniels might argue. His face was flushed with anger and frustration, his hand still resting on his baton. But finally, he stepped back, his movements reluctant. "Fine," he muttered through gritted teeth. "We'll go." Vin watched silently as the officers turned and walked back toward their cruiser. But as Daniels climbed into the car, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Vin's. An unspoken challenge passed between them, the kind of silent communication that spoke volumes. As the cruiser pulled away, Vin leaned back on the bench, exhaling slowly. He reached into the bag, pulling out the apple. Taking a bite, he glanced toward the trees where a small group of joggers had gathered, whispering among themselves. The game was just beginning. As the police cruiser rolled out of sight, Vin Diesel remained seated on the park bench, biting into his apple. The tension in the air was palpable, and although the immediate confrontation had ended, the eyes of bystanders lingered on him. Whispers floated through the crisp autumn air as joggers and passers-by speculated about what they had just witnessed. To them, Vin was just another homeless man being harassed by the authorities, an all-too-familiar scene in the park. But for Vin, the encounter was far from over. He had come here for a reason, and he knew that the events unfolding today would have far-reaching consequences. He had planned this carefully, and he wasn't about to let an overly aggressive Officer Daniels or a weary Sergeant Hayes derail his mission. Meanwhile, back in the police cruiser, Daniels sat rigidly in the passenger seat, his jaw clenched in frustration. "Something's off about that guy," he muttered, staring out the window. Hayes, driving with one hand and holding his coffee with the other, sighed deeply. "Daniels, you need to let it go. We didn't find anything. He's just a guy eating his lunch in the park." "No, he's not," Daniels snapped, turning to face his partner. "Did you see the way he talked to us? The way he just sat there like he was untouchable? People like that don't just hang around for no reason." Hayes shook his head, exasperation etched across his face. "People like what? Homeless? Quiet? Daniels, listen to yourself. What exactly did he do wrong?" Daniels didn't respond immediately, his thoughts churning. Finally, he said, "I'm going back." "Something about him doesn't add up." "Seriously?" Hayes groaned. "You're going to harass this guy again? Do you want to get us in trouble?" Daniels ignored him, pulling out his phone and typing something into the search bar. "Let me just run his name," he muttered. "Vincent Sinclair. Let's see what comes up." The moment the results appeared on the screen, Daniels froze. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the images and articles that confirmed what he had started to suspect. Vincent Sinclair wasn't just any man. He was Vin Diesel, one of the most recognizable actors in the world. "Holy..." Daniel's voice faltered as he turned the phone toward Hayes. Hayes glanced at the screen, nearly spilling his coffee in surprise. "You're kidding me," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That guy? That guy on the bench was Vin Diesel? Daniels nodded, his mind racing. Why would he be dressed like that? Why would he be sitting in the park acting like a homeless guy? Hayes shrugged, still trying to process the revelation. Maybe it's some kind of charity thing. He's always doing that kind of stuff, right? Or maybe it's a setup, Daniels said darkly, his paranoia kicking in. What if he's filming us? What if this whole thing is a test? Hayes groaned, rubbing his temples. You're overthinking it. He hasn't done anything illegal. If you go back there and mess with him again, you're going to end up on the evening news. But Daniels was already formulating a plan. I'm not messing with him, he said, his voice resolute. I just want answers. Back at the park, Vin had moved to a quieter corner near the edge of a small pond, where he sat tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. He had noticed Daniels and Hayes circling the park in their cruiser, but he remained unbothered. This was exactly the kind of reaction he had anticipated, and he was ready for what came next. Sure enough, a few minutes later, Daniels approached him again, this time alone. Hayes had stayed in the car, clearly reluctant to continue escalating the situation. Back so soon? Vin said calmly, tossing another breadcrumb into the water. The ducks quacked in response, their movements creating small ripples in the pond. Daniels stood in front of him, arms crossed, his demeanor more restrained but no less intense. I ran your name, he said bluntly. I know who you are. Vin didn't react, his expression unreadable. Congratulations, he said dryly. That must have taken a lot of effort. Why are you here? Daniels demanded. What are you trying to prove? Vin leaned back on the bench, letting the silence stretch for a moment before replying. I'm here because I wanted to see how people like you treat people like me, at least the person you thought I was. Daniels frowned, his face flushing slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Vin said, his voice steady, that you didn't see me as a person. You saw me as a problem, someone who didn't belong, and the way you treated me proves exactly what I came here to prove. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind raced, grappling with what Vin was saying. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down he knew there was truth in those words. Do you know how many people get treated the way I was today? Vin continued, his tone calm but firm. How many people are judged by their appearance, dismissed, or harassed just for existing in a public space? You didn't stop me because I was breaking the law. You stopped me because I didn't fit your idea of who should be sitting on a park bench. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his confidence shaken. I was just doing my job, he said weakly. No, Vin said, standing now, his full height towering over Daniels. Your job is to serve and protect. Your job is to treat everyone with respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. And today, you failed. Daniels took a step back, his face pale. He had never been confronted like this before, and he didn't know how to respond. Behind him, Hayes had stepped out of the cruiser, watching the exchange with a mix of unease and curiosity. Vin turned to Hayes, his gaze softening slightly. You knew it wasn't right, he said. I could see it in your face. You wanted to stop him, but you didn't. Hayes looked down, guilt written across his features. You're right, he admitted quietly. I should have said something. You still can, Vin said, his voice firm but not unkind. Every day, you have the chance to do better, to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. For a moment, the three men stood in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Finally, Vin picked up his paper bag and turned to leave. Wait, Hayes called out, taking a step forward. Why are you really doing this? Vin paused, looking back over his shoulder. Because change doesn't happen by itself, he said. Sometimes you have to shine a light on the problem before anyone sees it. With that, he walked away, disappearing into the crowd of parkgoers. Daniels and Hayes stood there, the gravity of the encounter sinking in. Neither of them would forget this day or the lesson they had learned. The courtroom was suffocating, the kind of stillness that pressed against the walls and squeezed the air from the room. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, a final punctuation to the weeks of manufactured testimony, doctored evidence, and whispered betrayals. "Guilty!" The word echoed like a gunshot. Daniel Reeves sat motionless, his wrists bound in cold steel cuffs, his expression unreadable. He had spent 15 years upholding the law, hunting down criminals in the darkest corners of New York City, chasing justice in a system that now saw him as disposable, a scapegoat. He had seen it coming. From the moment the first piece of evidence surfaced, evidence so perfectly damning it reeked of fabrication, he knew. When former colleagues avoided his gaze, when superiors who had once praised his instincts suddenly questioned his integrity, it became clear he was being buried alive. The jury had deliberated for only 2 hours. That was all it took to undo 15 years of service. But the conviction wasn't what twisted the knife in his chest. It wasn't the years of prison that awaited him, the disgrace that would follow his name. It was knowing they won. The judge rose from his seat, his robe rustling with the movement. The bailiff tightened his grip on Daniel's arm, prepared to drag him from the room. But before they could move him, Daniel lifted his chin. His voice was steady, sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Your Honor." The judge barely glanced at him. "You have nothing left to say, Mr. Reeves." Daniel exhaled. "One request." The courtroom stirred. A murmur rippled through the gallery, reporters shifting in their seats ready for something to scribble down. The judge sighed, impatience flickering in his eyes. "What request?" Daniel turned toward the back of the room. "Let me see him." The energy in the room shifted. Even the prosecutor, who had worn a smug expression since the trial began, stiffened slightly. The guards hesitated. The judge considered him for a moment, then exhaled sharply. 3 minutes. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open. Vin Diesel walked in. Not the movie star, not the larger-than-life action hero, the real Vin Diesel. A man who had walked through hell and returned without a scratch. A ghost. A force of nature operating in the margins of society where names didn't matter. Only actions did. His presence swallowed the room whole. His boots thudded against the polished floor, slow and deliberate. Diesel never rushed. He didn't need to. Every step he took was calculated, a silent warning that carried more weight than any words. Daniel had fought beside this man before, not on battlefields with flags and uniforms, but in places where the lines between right and wrong blurred, where the only law that mattered was survival. Diesel stopped in front of him. They didn't need words. He extended a hand, a firm, final handshake. Daniel took it, feeling the familiar strength in his grip. But then, something else. A small, solid object pressed into his palm, a recording device. Daniel didn't react, didn't shift, didn't flinch. The movement had been seamless, unnoticed by anyone else in the room. Diesel's fingers tightened just slightly. A silent message. Listen to it, then do whatever it takes. Then, he let go. The bailiff jerked Daniel backward. The chains clinked. Diesel turned, walking out of the courtroom as if he had never been there. Daniel curled his fingers around the device. Whatever was on it, it was going to change everything. The cab smelled of stale cigarettes and bad decisions. Diesel sat in the back seat, his face impassive as the city lights flickered past. In his palm, he rolled the tiny recorder between his fingers, small enough to be ignored, dangerous enough to bring a man like Mercer to his knees. He pressed play. A burst of static. Then voices. "Just plant the evidence," a gruff voice said. Cold. Confident. "No one's going to question it. Reeves has the perfect record, that's why it'll work." Diesel's grip tightened. A second voice. Younger. Hesitant. "And if he fights it?" A dry chuckle. "By the time anyone figures it out, he'll be rotting in a cell. This is a clean hit." Diesel rewound the tape. Listened again. Slower this time. He knew that voice. Captain Paul Mercer, Daniel's former boss. The same man who had testified with absolute certainty that Daniel was guilty. The same man who had once toasted to Daniel's success at the department's annual Christmas party. But now, Mercer's voice was caught on tape. This wasn't just corruption. This was a hit job. A career assassination. Diesel inhaled deeply, his mind already moving. The recording was damning, but not enough. Mercer was too careful, too connected. He knew how to clean up loose ends. One recording wouldn't bring him down. Diesel needed leverage. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line rang twice before a voice answered. Gruff, wary. Yeah? Diesel glanced down at the recorder. It's me, he said. A pause. Then a sigh. Jesus, what did you get yourself into? Diesel exhaled slowly. Not me, he said. Daniel. Another pause. Then, what do you need? Diesel's grip tightened. Away into Mercer's office, and a reason for him to start sweating. A low chuckle from the other end. Guess we're stirring up trouble again. Diesel's voice was steady. No, he said. We're finishing what they started. He rain-pounded against the cracked asphalt, washing away the city's filth but doing nothing to cleanse its corruption. Vin Diesel stepped out of the cab, his boots landing in a shallow puddle that rippled under the neon haze of a flickering streetlight. The weight of the recorder in his pocket was heavy, but not as heavy as the truth it carried. This wasn't just about setting Daniel Reeves free. It was about exposing the men who had buried him alive. He moved through a narrow side alley off East 42nd Street, past a rusted metal door that had seen too many desperate knocks over the years. He rapped twice. A low grumble came from inside, followed by the clatter of locks being undone. The door creaked open just wide enough for him to slip through. Inside, the room was dimly lit, cluttered with wires, half-assembled tech, and stacks of outdated hardware. Mickey Two-Tap Ferris leaned against a desk, arms crossed, his massive frame filling most of the space. The nickname came from his reputation. 2 hits, and whoever stood in front of him went down. He was the kind of man who looked more at home cracking skulls than working with audio equipment. But Diesel knew better. You're either in real deep or real stupid, Mickey muttered, eyeing the small recorder as Diesel placed it on the desk. This what brings you back? Diesel didn't blink. Make the voices clear. Mickey grunted, picking up the device and turning it over in his calloused hands. He sighed, then walked to an old rig in the corner. A Frankenstein mix of outdated processors and patched-together soundboards. The recorder clicked into a slot, and a second later, the voices filled the room. Just plant the evidence. Captain Paul Mercer's voice came through, smooth and sure. No one's gonna question it. Reeves has the perfect record. That's why it'll work. There was a pause, then another voice, nervous, hesitant. Detective Ryan Nix. And if he fights it? Mercer chuckled. By the time anyone figures it out, he'll be rotting in a cell. This is a clean hit. Mickey exhaled sharply and turned to Diesel. Cold as hell. Diesel didn't react, his eyes fixed on the screen where the waveform of Mercer's voice flickered. This enough to bring him down? Mickey leaned back, enough to get him nervous. But if you want to bury him, you need more. Diesel pulled out his phone, the screen glowing with a single name. Ryan Nix. His fingers hovered over the call button before he locked the screen and slid the phone back into his pocket. He knows where Mercer's skeletons are. Mickey smirked. And you think he's just gonna hand them over? Diesel turned for the door. He will. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Diesel made it to the high-end steakhouse on the corner of Lexington and 53rd, the kind of place where men like Nick spent their dirty money. Through the wide glass window, Diesel spotted him, dressed in an expensive suit, whiskey in hand, laughing with a woman half his age. Diesel didn't break stride as he pushed through the revolving door, moving with purpose past the maitre d', who barely had time to protest. He reached Nix's table and pulled out the chair opposite him. Nix looked up, confusion flickering across his face before panic set in. We need to talk, Diesel said, his voice calm but carrying weight. The blonde beside Nix looked between them. Who's this? Nix forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just an old friend. Diesel leaned forward slightly. You were in the room when Mercer gave the order. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small earpiece and sliding it across the table. Listen. Nix hesitated before pressing it to his ear. The color drained from his face as his own voice echoed back at him. His hand trembled as he set the earpiece down. Diesel didn't break eye contact. I have the recording, and unless you want your career to go up in flames along with Mercer's, you're going to help me. Nix licked his lips, his fingers tightening around his whiskey glass. You don't understand. Mercer isn't just some dirty cop. He's connected. Real power. Real people. If I talk, I'm dead. Diesel's expression remained unchanged. If you don't, you're already dead. Nix exhaled shakily, running a hand through his slicked-back hair. Jesus. His eyes darted around the room, as if Mercer's men were already closing in. Then, finally, his shoulders slumped. All right, but I need protection. You'll get it, Diesel said. Where does Mercer keep his failsafe? Nix hesitated, staring into his glass as if the answer was at the bottom. Then he muttered, his personal safe, at his house. But you can't get to it. Diesel stood. Watch me. Nix grabbed his wrist before he could walk away. You think you can just break into Mercer's house and take it? He's got security. Real security. Diesel smirked, slipping his hand free. I have a plan. As he stepped back out into the city, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets damp and shimmering under the glow of streetlights. Mercer thought he had covered his tracks, thought his network of power made him untouchable. But Diesel had seen men like him before, and they all fell the same way. The prison was cold, sterile, filled with the echoes of lives put on hold. Diesel walked through the dimly lit hallway, stopping in front of a metal door with a small viewing slot. The guard beside him unlocked it, stepping aside as he pushed it open. Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the floor. His hands, though no longer cuffed, still carried the weight of weeks spent in chains. When he looked up, his eyes met Diesel's, and for the first time in a long time, there was something new in them. Hope. Diesel pulled a folded document from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Mercer's done, he said simply. Daniel hesitated, then reached for the paper, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded it. An official release order. He let out a shaky breath. How? Diesel smirked. I have my ways. Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I owe you. Diesel shook his head. You owe yourself. The door creaked open again. The guard motioned. It's time. Daniel stood, the reality of his freedom sinking in. Diesel stepped aside, watching as his friend walked past him, into a world that had tried to erase him. As they stepped outside, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, golden against the city skyline. For the first time in weeks, Daniel Reeves breathed in fresh air as a free man. And Vin Diesel, the man who had fought for him, disappeared into the morning haze. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic beyond the quiet streets of Long Island. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick under the glow of streetlights. Vin Diesel stood in the shadows of a large oak tree, eyes locked on the house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Paul Mercer had built himself a fortress, a sprawling estate meant to keep men like Diesel out. But Diesel wasn't just any man, and Mercer's walls wouldn't be enough to stop him. He moved with precision, keeping low as he crossed the damp lawn, his boots silent against the trimmed grass. The house was quiet, but Diesel knew better than to assume he was alone. Mercer wasn't the kind of man to sleep soundly, not with the enemies he had made. Security cameras blinked red from the corners of the roof, scanning the property in slow, predictable arcs. Diesel waited, counting in his head, timing the movement. Then he moved, slipping between the blind spots like a ghost. The back entrance would be locked, alarmed, but Diesel wasn't aiming for the door. He had spent years perfecting the art of entry, breaking into places far more secure than a dirty cop's overpriced mansion. His eyes flicked to the second-floor balcony. It was a classic mistake. Mercer had fortified his lower-level doors, but assumed no one would climb. Diesel hooked his fingers around the edge of the drainage pipe, testing its weight before pulling himself up. The metal creaked under his grip, but only slightly. He moved fast, scaling the side of the house with practiced ease, reaching the balcony in seconds. He tested the door. Unlocked. Mercer's arrogance was a gift. Slipping inside, Diesel moved through the hallway like a shadow. The air smelled of old cigars and expensive whiskey. A single lamp was left on in the office at the end of the hall, casting a dim glow across the floor. Diesel stepped inside, his gaze scanning the room. The desk was cluttered with papers, a half-drunk glass of bourbon sitting beside an open laptop, but what he was looking for was behind the bookshelf. Nix had given him the exact details. Mercer's safe was hidden in the wall, disguised behind a row of legal books that had likely never been touched. Diesel reached out, gripping the edges of the shelf, and pulled. It slid back with a low groan, revealing the sleek metal door beneath. He wasn't surprised to see a biometric lock. Mercer had money, but he wasn't imaginative. Diesel pulled a small device from his jacket, a fingerprint scanner capable of lifting prints from any surface. Mercer's bourbon glass had been more than just a sign of indulgence. It had given Diesel exactly what he needed. He pressed the scanner to the pad, waited, and after a second, the lock beeped and released. The safe door swung open, stacks of cash, expensive watches, loose diamonds. Mercer had been hoarding wealth in every form, but Diesel wasn't here for money. He rifled through the contents, pushing past the valuables until he found what he needed. A thick folder, worn at the edges, filled with transaction logs, bank records, and names. The insurance policy Mercer had kept for himself, the evidence that could bring down everything. A voice cut through the silence. "I had a feeling you'd show up." Diesel turned slowly, already sensing the weight of the gun Mercer had aimed at him. The man stood in the doorway, dressed in dark slacks and an unbuttoned dress shirt, his expression more amused than angry. "You always were a stubborn son of a bitch," Mercer said, stepping into the room. "But breaking into my house? That's bold, even for you." Diesel remained still, assessing. Mercer wasn't alone. Men like him didn't take risks unless they had backup. Diesel could hear footsteps somewhere beyond the hallway, too distant to be an immediate threat, but close enough to make escape complicated. "You framed Reeves," Diesel said, voice calm. "You planted the evidence. You made sure the jury had no doubt." Mercer smirked, shaking his head. "Framed is such a strong word. I just made sure the right version of the truth got told." He gestured with the gun. He was a problem. Problems get removed. Diesel's jaw tightened. "You call destroying a man's life removing a problem?" Mercer shrugged. "That's how the world works. People like you and me, we don't get fairy tale endings." Reeves thought he could walk away clean. He was wrong. Diesel took a slow step forward. Mercer raised the gun slightly in warning. "You can kill me," Diesel said, voice low. "But I already sent copies of this to people who'd love to see you burn." Mercer's smirk faltered. Diesel saw the doubt creep into his eyes, the moment of hesitation that turned certainty into fear. That was all Diesel needed. He moved fast, knocking the gun aside and driving his fist into Mercer's ribs. The older man stumbled, gasping as Diesel twisted the weapon from his grip and leveled it at him. Mercer panted, gripping the desk for support. "You think this changes anything?" Diesel tightened his hold on the gun. "I know it does." The distant wail of sirens pierced the silence. Mercer's face darkened. "You brought cops here?" Diesel shook his head. Number Y brought the right cops. The front door burst open. Footsteps stormed through the house. Sarah Whitaker, a federal investigator Diesel had reached out to hours ago, stepped into the room, her badge gleaming under the dim light. "Paul Mercer," she announced, "you're under arrest." Mercer let out a slow, bitter laugh. "You son of a bitch." Diesel stepped back as Sarah's team swarmed Mercer, cuffing his hands behind his back. He didn't resist. There was no point. The game was over. The officers led Mercer out of the house, his downfall sealed within the pages of the files Diesel had pulled from the safe. As the last of them disappeared into the night, Diesel stood alone in the office, staring at the remnants of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. It was over. But there was still one more thing to do. The prison smelled of bleach and stale air, the walls cold, and sterile. Diesel walked down the dimly lit hallway, his boots echoing with each step. The guard beside him stopped in front of a steel door, unlocking it with a heavy clang. Daniel Reeves sat on the edge of his cot, hands resting on his knees. His face was tired, but his eyes held something they hadn't in weeks: hope. Diesel pulled a folded document from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Mercer's done," he said simply. Daniel hesitated before reaching for the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. An official release order. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "How?" Diesel smirked. "I have my ways." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. "I owe you." Diesel shook his head. "You owe yourself." The guard reappeared in the doorway. "It's time." Daniel stood, the weight of his imprisonment lifting as he stepped forward. Diesel followed, watching as his friend walked through the doors into the open air. The first light of dawn painted the sky in gold. Daniel Reeves took a deep breath as a free man. Vin Diesel, the man who had fought for him, disappeared into the morning haze.